Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlinn
and Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Kaos,
and most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link season 1.
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
Welcome to The Mything Link, episode 1. Today we are going to be covering Prometheus, and we have a special guest with us, Miss Dr. Almost, Kiese Hill. Kiese, do you want to give a little intro on who you are, what your specialty is, what you're about?
So my specialty is, Greek mythology, and I am a Milton girl. So John Milton, Paradise Lost is probably the most important English epic ever written. And so that is my specialty as far as working with him. And he is a perennialist. So he believes that all of this reoccurs over and over again throughout culture, and all of these stories have basis in our same psychology, and so that through them we can find our greater selves and understanding of the world and how we connect to the universe. So that's
so just light stuff. And Kiese is a teacher of high school English.
Yes, I teach high school English to 9th and 10th primarily. 9th and 10th. So an introduction to high school literature and writing, and then cultural literature in the 10th grade.
Awesome. And what are your degrees in for everybody?
So my undergrad is in folklore and creative writing with a specialty in poetry. I studied at University College Cork as well in Ireland for my junior year, which is how I gained the focus in folklore, which was amazing. And then my master's is in mythology and depth psychology. And my PhD will be the same in about a month as soon as I defend. So there we are.
So exciting.
I'm so
exciting.
So exciting.
Awesome. I'm so excited to have you here today to talk about Prometheus.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to give a shout out to our friend who's not on this call today, but our friend and colleague, Dr. Deborah Crossland, for giving me this amazing shirt that all my students roll their eyes at every time I wear it. It says Ancient Geese. And it has two geese wearing laurel wreaths.
That's fantastic. Yay, Deb.
Yeah. I felt like I had to wear it for today, episode 1 of Greek mythology. Shall we dive into one Prometheus? To start with, I'm going to give just a little character overview of who Prometheus is in ancient Greek mythology. So some folks like to refer to Prometheus as a god or lump him in with the gods, but he's actually a titan, which in Greek mythology, there are a ton of different deities that are not mortals, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're all gods. So as we continue through the season, we'll see this kind of play out through the different characters that we're going to be looking at. So it's really interesting. We're starting with Prometheus, who's a titan who is a cousin to Zeus, and he's the brother of Atlas, and also he has a twin brother named Epimetheus. And in most stories, Prometheus was basically the Titan who rebelled against the Titans and joined the Olympians for this huge titanic battle. And the Olympians won, Zeus and the Olympians won. And so Prometheus was considered allied with the Olympians. But then he thought Zeus was becoming too tyrannical as a leader. And so he allied himself with the humans against the Olympians. So Prometheus just kind of bops around and joins the side that he thinks is just. He doesn't really have a firm sense of loyalty. So one of the stories about him, he's tasked with creating humanity on Earth by Zeus after Zeus has tried a couple times and failed. Prometheus gives it a go by making humanity out of clay, and his twin brother Epimetheus is tasked with making all the animals to populate the earth. And Zeus gives the brothers this big pile of attributes to dole out amongst the humans and the animals. And while Prometheus is very delicately crafting humans out of clay and water, his brother Epimetheus just threw together a bunch of animals and dove into the pile of attributes and just started passing them out willy-nilly to the point where when Prometheus turned around and looked at the pile, there were only two things left. And those two things were intelligence and walking upright. So those were the only two gifts bestowed on humanity from the gods because of Epimetheus. So we've got the names of Prometheus and Epimetheus, and math means to think in ancient Greece, and pro means before, and epi means after, of course, prologue, epilogue. And so their names are literally like, it's like the original Mufasa in Scar. Their names are like foresight or forethought and afterthought. And that feels a little rude to me. Because when I first read that, I was like, wow, like the second one just came afterwards and what an afterthought. But it describes their personality, unfortunately. Because Epimetheus is like this bumbling Homer Simpson type is what I got from it. Like just totally foolish and doing it whatever he wants. Prometheus is kind of the opposite. So after Prometheus created humanity, he felt bad because the animals got all of those great attributes. They got the fur, they got the night vision, they got the cunning, they got the speed. They have all of these things that humans don't. And so he saw the humans down there basically just like naked and afraid and cold. And he didn't think that this was right. And so since there were no more attributes to go around, he decided, like, screw Zeus, I'm gonna take matters into my own hands, and this is not acceptable for these humans to be living like this. I like to imagine he's like, hey guys, I got you into this mess, I'm gonna get you out of it. Right. That's like my personal take on the story. And so he goes, and with Hera's help, Hera collects an ember from the fire and puts it into a torch for Prometheus to carry down. And of course, Hera's not seen as the hero of this story for helping get fire to humanity, but that's,
There's versions where it's Athena too.
Oh,
Athena and the fennel stalk.
The fennel stalk.
I was reading that like there's some correlation between Prometheus helping Athena be birthed out of Zeus, so they have a special relationship. And so when Zeus says he's mad and he's like swearing revenge on Prometheus and saying like, good luck humans, eat your meat raw or whatever, Prometheus goes to Athena and says, help me sneak up the backside of Mount Olympus and steal fire to take back to the humans. And so she like lets him in, and he lights a torch and then like takes a coal and puts it in the fennel stalk, sneaks back down, and then gives the coal to humans. And then part of the problem that Zeus has is that he, instead of like taking ownership of his vindication, he says Athena and Prometheus were like having an illicit love affair, and then leads to like Prometheus' brother marrying Pandora because he's now panicking because Zeus is mad because Prometheus warned him not to. I don't know. It's like this whole complicated mess, but it's so interesting.
You mean it's chaotic?
Oh, is it chaos theory?
Pure chaos. But in all versions, he manages to take this fire from the gods on Mount Olympus down to the humans, and he essentially brings them this technology and teaches them how to use it, how to cook with it. And in anthropology, we have this debate, was it the heat or the meat that caused humans to advance? And ancient Greek mythology tells us that it was Prometheus who provided the heat that taught humans how to cook the meat and how to survive. Since Prometheus teaches the humans to cook the meat, Zeus is pissed about the fire, but he's like, okay, all these burnt offerings smell delicious as the smoke is carrying the scent of the meat up to Mount Olympus. And the people on Earth sacrificed a bull for Zeus, and Prometheus was like, hey, wait a minute, you're giving Zeus the best parts of your sacrifice, and you're like not getting enough for yourself. Basically this idea of like, you can't take care of anybody else before you take care of yourself, right? That the sacrifice should be extra, which goes against the whole idea of sacrifice, right? To make sacred by like giving and offering the best part. So here we see the sin of Cain and Abel of offering the least best parts to the gods for the sacrifice. And Prometheus is like, no, let's turn this around on Zeus and make him dig his own grave, essentially. So Prometheus took a bull and separated all of the meat into two piles. One pile was basically just garbage, bones, and then covered with delicious smelling fat. So it looked really, really enticing. And the other pile was the really, really good meat, but it was covered with tendons and skin and all the unsavory parts. And so Zeus, looking at these two piles, he's like, okay, idiots. Yeah, I'm going to pick this delicious fatty pile. He gets it. He realizes he's been tricked, and he's furious that Prometheus does not have his back. And this, of course, is a cautionary tale to think beneath the surface and not judge a book by its cover and all of those things. So as a punishment, he decides to chain Prometheus up to a cliffside in the Caucasus mountain range. He chains him up to a cliff, very crucifixion style in most artistic depictions. And because he's a Titan, Prometheus is immortal. So Zeus sends one of his patron animals, an eagle, to peck Prometheus's liver out every single day. And then the eagle leaves at night, and Prometheus regrows like Wolverine style. His liver regrows, he heals overnight, and then wakes up the next morning just to start it all over again. So we see this play out in Kaos a number of ways. Caitlin, would you like to take us into how Prometheus is portrayed?
So he's played by Stephen Delane. The reason we're talking about Prometheus at all is because he's the narrator of Kaos. And from the beginning of the show, we see Prometheus chained up on the mountain with the eagle pecking out his liver. You literally see it hanging out. I think they tell us right in the beginning that it's Prometheus who's narrating the story. And we're given insight into him being Zeus's oldest friend. And willy-nilly, Zeus is taking him down from the mountain to ask him for advice. In the show, he's chained there for what Randall gave us a little insight into, which is stealing fire from the gods and sharing it with humanity. So we see that thread being portrayed in the show.
Yeah, and Kaos basically picks up after that. So they don't necessarily give context. They just give little clues and hints here, but that's the backstory.
So we don't know a lot about Prometheus as narrator of Kaos really throughout the entirety of the show.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into a few of those complexities throughout our episode today. But I think the biggest takeaway here is knowing the context and background of Prometheus as a character in ancient Greek mythology. It'll be interesting to see where Kaos takes him and his motivations and how they weave all that into the story.
Something that's interesting too about Prometheus as the narrator of Kaos, he's telling people right off the bat that there are 3 humans who are going to participate in the downfall of the gods. And typically, Prometheus is somebody who is seen fighting on behalf of humans. He defies Zeus and the other Olympians and the Titans in order to be benevolent towards humanity. So typically he symbolizes knowledge and progress in human civilization. As a divinity in Greek mythology and a figure in Greek mythology, he's more associated with working on behalf of humans than he really is with the gods. And that's part of why I think it's really interesting that he's the narrator of the show Kaos, depicting to us that there are these 3 humans who are ultimately going to not in this case, he's not only acting in benevolence to humanity, he's actively acting against the gods, which I think really speaks to his figure as what you were saying before, Randall, somebody who doesn't really associate with one side or another. He associates more with outcomes and picks based on outcomes more than just loyalty to being a Titan or a god.
Right. And we can see Prometheus as a figure that is committed to fighting for what's right instead of fighting for who he's loyal to. So I wrote a question: a strong sense of justice without loyalty. Is Prometheus autistic? Sorry, it's just a general question. So there you go.
He is very relatable.
In the context of the ancient Greek deities, they're typically very ego-driven and picky and catty and petty and like all of the negative things about humanity as well as the positive things. And with Prometheus, ancient sources don't really give us the bad things about him. He's typically seen as this like kind of like hero, anti-hero, warrior of justice, depending on who's telling the story.
He's above the earth but below Mount Olympus, right? I think something that he's like, right, because he's chained on the mountain. He's looking down at humans. But something that I love also about the depiction of Prometheus is somebody who's generally benevolent. Like you're saying, there's not a lot of negative connotation with Prometheus. He still somehow represents that there is danger in fighting for the greater good. There is danger in challenging authority in pursuit of what's best for everybody.
Absolutely. And
like,
we'll definitely get into a little bit more of that. But there's one of his quotes in episode 4 is the greater good comes at a personal cost.
Right.
And he is so symbolic of that idea of what true sacrifice actually is, which is so funny because he essentially taught the humans not to sacrifice. And then he becomes this, no spoilers, but you know, he sacrificed something for himself, sure, but he made the decision to sacrifice.
Right. He's really interesting.
I thought he was such a neutral figure. And then we started really diving into him. And I'm like, he is complicated and messy.
Yes.
And
he's a neutral figure, but he's also a really contrarian figure and a really provoking figure.
Yeah, like, he's a trickster, right?
He is, absolutely.
He's in there to mess us up and set us on a new path, I think is like the biggest, most important thing of what tricksters do.
Sure, absolutely.
They interrupt the plot.
Yes, which he definitely does.
Yeah, and crafts the plot as well, as we'll see throughout Chaos and how he is instrumental in how everything plays out throughout the season.
He's not just narrating the plot, he's driving the plot. But Zeus doesn't seem to know that.
Thank God we're smarter than Zeus, huh?
Who isn't smarter than Zeus is the question.
I will say that by the time you get to episode 8 in Chaos, my note literally says, oh my God, this whole thing went into action because Prometheus thought this would ultimately free him. And I don't think that that's a spoiler, like that the events got set into place, because it's really interesting because mythologically speaking, that seems to be Prometheus's motivation as well. So I'm like constantly impressed with how this show is integrating all these different layers of mythology and character development.
You definitely see pieces of that like throughout the series too. Like there's other intervals and other episodes where you see Prometheus showing that he has foresight, forethought, if you will. And it'll be spoilers if I continue on. But it's like
he has a couple really good quotes that I pulled in episode 3. He says, love can overpower all reason sometimes. And that really resonated with me. Like the role of him as a narrator and directing, especially the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, like it feels very, very powerful. In episode 4, we see him have a very close, intimate relationship with a human. A character who I didn't realize was a human, or maybe canonically he's not. We'll get to that when we get to the underworld. And in that episode, Prometheus says the greater good comes at a personal cost, always. And I thought that was such a episode 4 is a heavy, heavy, big one. And that I feel like really sums up a lot of ancient Greek mythology and like worldwide hero's journey and all of that, right? Like until you're ready and willing to fully sacrifice yourself in ways that you may have never expected before, society isn't going to progress. Things aren't going to move forward.
So Zeus, in one of the stories, would release Prometheus from his chains if he essentially takes everything back and confesses that he was wrong and essentially tries to undo everything. But he won't. He refuses.
I was going to say, I don't think he would do that because that's not...
He knows that humans are better off and that he's not going to take that away. And it's really important that they're able to continue growing and learning everything that they have. So I thought that was a really interesting one. And it goes well, of course, with the Chaos, the show, that they're pulling out those little threads of Prometheus and his, that he seems to be Zeus keeps yanking him off the wall but then always returning. And of course, it's more important to tell the story and make sure that things continue than it is to end his personal suffering.
Mm-hmm. What my favorite part of the Prometheus and popular culture, okay, my students are going to kill me for this. I'm going to use a pre-2000s reference. I've been explicitly told not to use those. And I'm like, y'all, we're talking about ancient mythology. Like everything's pre-2000s references in this class.
Gen Z and Gen Alpha are unhinged.
I love it. I love it. I respect it deeply. But in 1996, when I was 10 years old, there was a cartoon or a variety show on, I think it was on Nickelodeon, and it was called KaBlam. And there was a segment, it was where cartoons and comics collide. And there was a segment that was done with stop motion animation, and it was called Prometheus and Bob. And Bob was like a Neanderthal type, like cave person man. And Prometheus was this alien, and he'd come down in a spaceship, and they were all like found footage tapes where it was like, okay, like day one attempts with the human and Prometheus. And there's no, I should have watched it in prep for this, but I don't think there's any dialogue. It's just an alien and a caveman, and he's trying to teach him different aspects of technology, and the caveman keeps failing repetitively. So that was like my first introduction to Prometheus, and that's always my association, is that he, like, in bringing fire to humanity, he brought the technology, right? And we use his name in so many things that have to do with not only that fire, but also technology. And even one of my favorite spooky gals, Mary Shelley, referenced Prometheus in her title for Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. And that speaks, of course, to the fire and the electricity of creating him, but also to
our
so
failure, to take responsibility for that technology. Because of course, that's why Zeus didn't want, or one of the reasons in one of the stories, Zeus didn't want mankind to have fire, was because we would only use it to kill each other. And he wasn't wrong.
Not that Zeus himself is super benevolent, just to be clear about that.
Zeus is the worst. And that's something I love about what Kaos is doing, is they're showing like what an ego-driven, narcissistic piece of shit Zeus truly is. And like
with his Casio
that
watch.
just makes my heart so happy. It makes my heart so happy. I know that watch is out of control. I feel like if you're wearing that watch, you're like doing a lot of cocaine in Miami in the 80s. But anyways, yes, personal cost, all of the things.
That watch.
Oh, and I forgot to say, his main worshipers in ancient Athens were potters, because of his associations with both fire and clay. And the Athenians held a torch race in his honor that we still continue to emulate today, in the Olympic torch race, symbolizing bringing fire from humanity to humanity.
We're typically used to the fire piece, but Prometheus makes man, and so has to go to the gods and go to the heavens to bring something down as a gift to bestow upon man, and he brings fire. It's kind of representative of the thought that he brings mankind. So, math, science, religion, everything that he kind of brings. But of course, that upsets Zeus because it gives man too much independence. And then so they are bestowed, of course, Pandora as a punishment, who then releases all the evils on the world. And then possibly one of the most dangerous things is hope. But there are other versions where hope is good, and Prometheus is giving mankind hope, but taking away mankind's forethought and ability to see the future. So we have hope for our future, so we cannot see.
I've also seen in some versions, Epimetheus is Pandora's husband, and it's like his bumbling foolishness that encourages Pandora to open the jar and like creates this plague. And so not only did he give all of the fur and the cunning and the good sight and the swiftness to the animals he created, leaving nothing for mankind, he also released all of these plagues and terrible things upon us. And it's so interesting that we don't know his name and we know Pandora.
Right.
That's a conversation for another day. But I would, in Ovid's Metamorphoses, the Metamorphoses of Ovid, he says in book 1 that Prometheus, when he fashioned man, his mold recalled the masters of all things, the gods, and while all other animals are bent, head down, and fix their gaze upon the ground, to man he gave a face that is held high. He had man stand erect, his eyes upon the stars. So was the earth, which until then had been so rough and indistinct, transformed. It wore a thing unknown before, the human form.
That's beautiful.
I love it. And it talks about how Prometheus made humanity by mixing the earth with fresh rainwater. And that's how he molded us out of the clay in a divine image.
Well, and then he gives birth to the line that Deucalon and Pyrea come from. That is the flood. And he tells them how to build the ark to save the people from the anger of the gods who create the flood. Which was another really beautiful about the rainwater and the clay and that kind of the resetting of the world and starting over again, but that he has the forethought to try to save some of them.
Yeah. And in Ovid's retelling, at least, it seems as though Zeus doesn't talk about Prometheus saving them specifically. It seems like it's more by chance. And Zeus is like, oh, well, good thing the humans who survived were good, pious humans who respect the gods.
Right.
And then they're tasked with repopulating the earth. And then we get the imagery of the bones of your mother, I think is the way that they put it. And that's taking the rocks and throwing them. So it's interesting. We have these parallels of humans created from clay and from bone in the same way that Genesis tells the story, or in a similar way that Genesis tells the story.
Well, which is why scholars, again, like Milton, even back in the 1600s, were already kind of predicting where we are right now as far as academically, that, you know, really thinking out that kind of perennial idea that there's all this literature seems to have these key points. And you can talk about how one is mimicking or taking from another, but that doesn't solve all of the issues. And so they're clearly, Milton's going to say essentially that these daemons, or like Prometheus, like Hermes Trismegistus, people who stand between the gods and men to help us tell these stories and reconnect with who we are, that there's some kind of, we'll say archetypal from depth psychology, but stories that are kind of housed within our spirit that come through generations, through the clay and the bone and the rain, that we somehow absorb these stories and retell them over and over again all over the world without any kind of awareness of similarities.
I think it's important to note, especially for stories like flood stories, we see them repetitively over and over again in almost every culture around the world. And there are a few theories as to this, right? Like that one of them is that people travel and they bring their stories with them. And as people spread, the stories spread. And perhaps there's like one seed of this story that's spread out. And now we're having different iterations. Or perhaps it's the idea that, especially for floods, that humans have to live near a water source to survive.
Right.
And part of the human experience is experiencing floods or droughts or whatever it is. And that's kind of like an archetypal human experience in and of itself. And so, of course, humans would create stories around that shared experience.
Right. And the reality is it's probably a good mixture of both, because like you said, we are taking stories from our ancestors that we carry. And then also, of course, you know, we do update those stories or have to live those stories and reenact those stories because we, like you said, we are going to have to deal with droughts. We are going to have to deal with floods. And so we reclaim those stories in a very lived, embodied kind of way for ourselves that make them, hand them down to also our next generation as a remembered occurrence because we had to live it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important that we define what we mean by archetypal as well before we go forward. I know that's not a word that everybody uses in their everyday life. Caitlin, you want to give us the beginnings of the I mean us. Yeah.
I don't know. I struggle with archetypes because I hate making them sound too universal. I don't like to universalize across myths, but I do think, you're talking about flood stories and how they kind of emerge in all these different cultures. And I think there are universal aspects of being embodied and being a human. And I like to think of archetypes as kind of these, I don't want to say stereotypes, but these basic stories or molds that kind of emerge out of like people's differing lived experiences and unconscious. And I don't want to push anybody into them or like limit anybody to an archetype, but Prometheus as, or some sort of divinity on behalf of the humans, like many mythologies and cultures have a figure who was willing to defy some other god to give some sort of power to a human or something along those lines. Like you have Inanna or the scarab beetle or Jesus, these figures that die and are rebirthed and resurrected again. Those kind of mythical, transcendental ideas that follow from culture to culture, even though they're very different per culture or in terms of particularities.
Yeah, I like to think instead of like
a good starting
box,
place or not, but
no, I think it's a great starting place. And like instead of a box, I like to think of like a skeleton or like a foundation that the archetype exists and then gets like fleshed out by all the different cultural details or that sort of thing. And so like we have the archetype, the ones I immediately think of just because of the phase of my life I am in is maiden, mother, crone, and those archetypes and how they pop up. And it's not only like how people embody those like character types, but also how we connect with them through relationally. Right? Like whether they're in lateral relations or hierarchical relations or whatever that looks like, our relationship with these types and that aspect of our personality, right? Because the idea is that we're all made up of, we're complex creatures and we're not just one dimensional like many of the gods are, like embodiments of specific feelings or emotions or whatever it is. Like Aphrodite is love personified. Yeah, just these archetypal experiences that we can have, and the meaning and the value and the cultural impact and all of those like depends on our culture that we're coming from.
Absolutely. And I think that's how we talk about archetypes differently in our area of mythology than say someone who's, maybe very specifically a certain kind of psychology, because we're not looking at a trapped idea, something in a box where we're looking for the specific kind of archetype. We are looking at a skeleton, and this is how various cultures, flesh that out based on their lived experience, their language. Some languages are going to have 1 million words for snow and some are going to have none. That doesn't mean like, we are looking to put something in a box. That's just how language works and evolves because we need different stories to express who we are and our world around us. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that I see with people trying to discuss archetypes. I know that, my daughter ran into problems last year. She was writing a paper about archetypes and about animals and how animals understand the world as well. And she was specifically talking about trauma, animals that have trauma or people that have trauma, and how we can help each other, work through those. But that you have to be aware of even animals having trauma and nightmares. And her teacher didn't understand how she was using the term archetype. She thought, well, dogs don't have, a Prometheus. They don't have a Jesus. They don't have a... but that doesn't mean they don't have...
What? No dog Jesus?
Right? It doesn't mean they don't have real trauma around...
I thought all dogs went to heaven, though.
They do, but they have their own cultural heavens.
It's true. I was
like,
actually like reading this thing. It was like comparing whale intelligence to human intelligence, and like humans always try to like ascribe or understand the intelligence of whales equivocal to our own, and you just can't, because they're culturally not the same thing. Even though like the idea of some sort of sentient intelligence is pretty like universal across most species, if you will.
Well, and that's new to, these last several generations, right? With gorillas in the mist kind of thing. Because prior to that, again, so much of our understanding of the world was so limited to kind of a manifest destiny, Christian colonial perspective that then very much was judging from our own kind of concept of what spirit or God. And then so other people don't have it, they're not people then. They don't have the qualified intelligence to have a conversation. And I think that really grown, in studies. We're still obviously working on that. There's still a lot of academia that does head that direction. So I think this is an important conversation about what, archetypes are, and making sure that cultures are allowed and respected for fleshing out their stories in their own way.
That's like some of the beef that I have with Jung is that he is a little colonial about his understanding of archetypes, and
oh really,
a little bit racist about it too.
You don't say.
Very much. I think of like I've taught a number of classes on Christian history, and in 1444 you have the Portuguese Catholics landing on Western Africa for the first time, deciding that Black people were lesser already because their culture was different. They didn't use silverware, they didn't dress the same, and you suddenly have the birth of this whole complex system that's affecting all of us even today. That's always my hesitance with archetypes, because Randall and I were just talking about how the victor writes history, and oftentimes it's been the white man who's decided which archetype is actually true, and like what interpretation of, for example, Prometheus we're going to use, because for many people in our context that means the Titanic, for example, but that's not necessarily true or real or something that another person in another culture would even think of.
Right, and it's interesting, like when we're talking about the patriarchy, I guess, or the misogyny like inherent in mythology and who's writing these stories down, like, I mean, just look at the way, the differences between the way Zeus and Hera are portrayed and what the crimes of Zeus are versus the crimes of Hera, right? Like Hera's depicted as full-on mad woman in the attic, just insane, jealous, crazy wife. Like she's the Yoko Ono. And there's no mention about the abuse that she was taking at the hands of Zeus, even if it was just the emotional abuse of being cheated on repetitively and knowing that your husband is not only cheating on you, but is actively assaulting many of these women that he's with. And like we see the evidence for this in the stories, but the way that they're told, like Zeus is king of the gods, he's the hero, and Hera is this bitter, jealous, nagging wife, essentially.
I think that a lot of that, I think that we're still looking to retranslate some of these works because we're getting them through that colonial perspective as well, because of who has translated or who tells those stories and who is nitpicking which stories we tell. Because of course, the first people that started colleges, they were purposely, we're going to go logical and we're going to like cut out some of this mythological kind of thing. So anything that sounds magic-y or God, stuff, we're going to cut out even from Plato, and we're just not going to, we're going to throw it in the dustbins of history where they belong. And so I think that I love the new Odyssey translated by
Emily Wilson.
Emily Wilson.
Ooh, I haven't read it. I'll have to pick it up.
It's so good. It's so good. My new favorite.
Okay. Wow. High praise. Emily Wilson, if you're listening to this, we'd love to have you on. Thanks.
Yes.
Well, because there's so much that because it was translated by men with an agenda, we're not receiving maybe the story the way that even the Greeks wanted it to be told. Because Hera is the goddess of marriage, and I think that she plays a really important role in trying to define and protect that marriage. That sometimes, even with Edith Hamilton, in some ways, especially with Edith Hamilton, that she becomes the mad woman in the attic, because that's not the representation that we wanted of women in that time period.
This is a big conversation.
Nope.
I know, humongous. And we'll have to dig more into it when we get to Hera later this season. But like the way that she's depicted in Kaos is, yes, she has those jealous tendencies and she's like petty and punishing and all of those things. And she's also totally freaking badass.
Yeah, she
is. When you get to the later episodes in the season, she gives this killer monologue to Zeus.
I am the queen.
Oh, yes. And I have that written down in my notes, all caps, period after every sentence. I am the queen. Like, she is killing it. Yes, I cannot wait for you to get to the end.
The translation issue is like, oh my God, that's such a big conversation in the Christian community too. And like the format we have our Bibles in now have been specifically translated and edited for a specific purpose. But I was reading the Robert Graves version of the Prometheus myth today and just thinking like, you know, Randall, you were saying that Prometheus' brother is the like Homer Simpson, but in Robert Graves, it's Pandora who's the dopey ass wife who is the one who opens the box that Prometheus went to all this great trouble to seal and warn his brother not to open, and like he turns his back and Pandora opens it and it's her fault all of a sudden. It's the woman's fault per the usual that we have all sorts of like sin and downfall and all this stuff in the world. And it just like I've read so many versions of this at this point, and it's just I just am sitting here mind blown that this is still like
I was gonna say, like, especially we see historically speaking in the earlier creation stories that, and even Epimetheus's name, right? He doesn't have the foresight, like, and he's the exact foil of Prometheus. And if we want to think of it like Prometheus, if this is a Bert and Ernie situation, or like for the foil, we have Prometheus with the autism, the structure, the loyalty, the fierceness, the loyalty to truth and justice. And then we have Epimetheus with the ADHD who has no foresight, and he's just running all over the place like, oh, you have this whole pile of attributes, Zeus, for me to give to the creations? Great. And he doesn't even consider anything Prometheus needs or wants. So we already have that story of Epimetheus. Then why would we ever possibly think that it's Pandora who opened the box without thinking, right? Like, just Epimetheus is barely even a blip in the story sometimes. And we all know Pandora's name, and she's just so famous that we even have companies named after her that are specifically referring to like Pandora music, right? Like once you open up your world. Yeah. And I hate it because it was really a jar. And I hate that I'm like that person that it was Pandora's jar and not her box.
No, I like the jar. The jar makes much more sense. But that's, of course, and then, you know, throw to Caitlinn, because that's, of course, because we're looking at it through a Western Christian lens. And so instead of equivalent of the two brothers or the Cain and Abel kind of moment, we're really looking at the Adam and Eve kind of moment, and we're reinterpreting her as Eve, because of course the everyone during that Middle Age kind of period was looking at pieces of the Bible and Greek mythology, and then of course in the Renaissance as well, and going, oh look, you know, poor guys, they didn't get it right because they didn't have the Bible, but they were really trying to talk about Eve and not the jar but the apple. And so we lose the brother along the way because we're so stuck in that idea, which in the Torah, of course, wasn't there. There was no Eve was sinful and a loser or any of that. None of that was there. It just comes
Eve's not a loser.
I know. Poor baby.
Eve was an autonomous, independent woman. Go Eve.
Exactly. Well, we don't get that until the church fathers, that there's something wrong with her, that she does it wrong. And so it's a complete reinterpretation of even the biblical portion.
Well, and it's interesting you bring up Cain and Abel in that capacity, because I wrote down Cain and Abel in my notes on the Prometheus story, but not in this part. in the burnt offering part where Prometheus splits the bowl, right?
Yes.
And so we see parallels there of the Cain and Abel story. So in popular culture, Prometheus is depicted in Rockefeller Plaza where they do the ice rink in New York City. Yeah, there's a big golden statue and it's of Prometheus carrying fire and bringing it down to the humans. It's a big, huge gold statue and it's like flowing robes and he's like carrying the fennel stalk.
Did you catch the connection to the Atlantis myth? I was reading
with his brother.
No.
Isn't Atlantis
with
named
Atlas? Yeah.
with Atlas.
So I went back.
Well, yeah, isn't that his brother?
I think that was unclear whether it was his actual brother or not. He's linked to Atlas for sure, with the holding the weight of the world. And Atlas, of course, has the same thing, right? He can only let it go if he finds someone else to carry it for him.
Yeah, and doesn't he give it to somebody else? And then he's like, haha, tricked you. And they're like, oh, okay, can you give me a second to like adjust my pants or something? Like, can you hold this world really quick? And he's like, oh yeah, and got tricked back into it. Little Tom Sawyer situation, it feels like.
I was reading about how, Atlas, he ruled the coastline in an area that was bigger than Asia and Africa all put together. And it was Atlantis. And they were like a super incredibly advanced people that were super benevolent and generous. But then at a certain point, they flipped and became greedy and corrupt. And so
Poseidon sunk them under the waves or something, right?
Yeah, he sent the Athenians to one-off them, and then the gods were still pissed, so they sent a flood, a deluge, to drown Atlantis, and it became consumed by the water, but spared Atlas. And so Atlas and the other brother with the
Menoetis, Epimetheus, Prometheus, and Atlas.
Menoetius?
Menoetius. So it looks like Atlas and Menoetius took the side of the Titans and fought against their brothers. And when they were defeated, Menoetius was cast into Tartarus in the underworld as punishment for his rebellion. And Atlas was tasked with holding up the sky or the world.
Prometheus was wiser than Atlas and foresaw the rebellion against Kronos, and therefore he went to Zeus's side because he wasn't attached to sides, but more the outcome. He was indeed the wisest of his race, was a quote that I read. Per the usual, Zeus decides to destroy humans, and then he only doesn't do it because Prometheus asks him not to, but then he gets more angry because humans keep advancing, and he just basically smote this entire civilization of humans that had advanced too far, and it's this almost same archetypal story over and over again, if you will.
That is interesting. And I really like how, Kiese was saying, how Kaos in the show, Prometheus keeps being summoned by Zeus, and he's functioning almost as Zeus's conscience or something like that, right? And he keeps referring to folks' prophecy. And in episode 6, he said, prophecy is what we make it. And he explains to Zeus that the prophecies will only come true if the person believes in them. And so it's really interesting that individual belief gives these prophecies powers. And even with the gods, even with Zeus, those prophecies won't come true unless he puts power in that. But now that he knows it, he's just as fallible as humans, which is one thing I love about Greek mythology, is that the gods are more human than human. They're intense versions of both the good and the bad in humanity. And we don't they're up on pedestals, but they shouldn't be. And Kaos is really exposing that dysfunction of the Greek family, and having Prometheus as this outsider, as this conscience, as this little angel on Zeus's shoulder, as his ego is raging
or
on the
devil.
other side. Yeah, I know. I mean, if Prometheus is acting in his self-interest, but also it's helping people along the way, or is his primary intention helping people and he also happens to get helped along the way? Does it matter?
You never know with the Greek gods. It's chaotic.
I know.
Well, I think like you were saying, that is part of what I love about Greek mythology, that obviously some people really talk down about, and they try to make in very, very many kind of current renditions a very soap opera kind of thing. However, obviously it's beautiful and important from a depth psychological moment, because of course these are our greatest fears and our greatest desires. So we could point to a lot of men today that would want that Zeus power over other people, over women, over being able to take what they want and, following their own greedy heart. And so, this is what you look like. This is what you become. Is this really the kind of person you want to be? Because now look at it. We have to suffer these consequences because of these kinds of actions. The gods don't have to. But they do give us a good window as to the kind of the results of following that kind of idea or belief system or desire that we have, and acting out those which should stay in your id, somewhere in the back of your mind where you thought of it, but then thought better than to do it. But the Greek gods go ahead and do it, and they kind of show us how some of those things are so ridiculous and offensive and wouldn't do us any good if we followed those intentions.
Absolutely. And as you were speaking, it made me think of like the way that Prometheus looks to camera throughout the series. Like he has this ultra divine knowledge that's even greater than the gods, as some sort of like older titanic life form, that he has this foresight and this ability to tell the story and to drop these little hints. And he doesn't even, like, the story tells us that he's in pain, but his character in Kaos doesn't seem to be in pain when he's chained to the rock. He's like annoyed, he's uncomfortable, he's frustrated with Zeus, but it seems like the punishment is more isolation and loneliness than the eagle, even though we see like his liver kind of hanging out the side.
Well, and that would be my critique, is that what kind of sacrifice do we have without pain? And even his loneliness, because he can be yanked at any point and talk to Zeus, because he's talking to camera. So there creates an intimacy with the person, the viewer, but also an intimacy with everyone he seems to be aware of what's going on. And so I think we're missing some of that, even loneliness he's suffering from, or should be suffering from. I think that we missed part of that. And I think that would be my biggest critique about even using Prometheus as the narrator, or not showing some of the depth of his sacrifice. It helps us create the story, of course, around the characters that are on Earth, and really magnify their emotional complexity. But I'm sorry that we're missing some of his emotional complexity.
That's a really good point that I hadn't thought of. Thank you for sharing that. And I think I agree with you. One of the most painful things as a human being is to be alone. Pain itself be damned. Being alone, being on your own, being isolated. I mean, that's why people who are put into solitary confinement kill themselves or lose their minds, because that's so much worse than being, physical.
And Kaos explores that too with the Minotaur. Slight spoiler alert, I guess. In Kaos, the Minotaur is depicted as a human who's been put in isolation and driven crazy as a result, instead of like part man and part bull, like we see in some versions of the tale.
Isolation is a trauma, and it rewires your brain. And at a certain point, when there's no beginning or end to the trauma, that's when you have CPTSD.
Absolutely. But also, yes, and perhaps that's the whole idea with Prometheus, like he was able to speak to Io on her path of wandering and give her the hope, the dangerous hope that she needed to continue on. With his foresight, he probably is able to foresee his release and have that allow him to carry him through. And then one could argue exactly, like, is that true sacrifice if he knows that there's going to be an end date to it, or if he's orchestrating this end date, or if he's pulling the strings with Zeus in order to facilitate the end of his punishment? I don't know, but that's a very human desire, right? To want your suffering to end and to do everything in your power to control the situation to end that suffering.
Well, what's interesting is obviously we'll get to the Minotaur, but the Eurydice right from the very beginning, it's much more that pain of loneliness, even surrounded by or followed by or whatever, someone who desperately loves her but never sees her for who she is. And then a mother, of course, who abandons her. So that loneliness and despair of being around a million people, but having no one actually see you or hear you, that she's calling out for help, asked him, can't you love me quieter, is, so heartbreakingly lonely. It's interesting that he tells her tale and that we start with her while he's, of course, chained and separate from everybody else. But he is, in so many of the Greek pieces, he is that kind of lonely character because he's not really a Titan. He's sort of people's brothers, but he's always separated in some kind of way. Mm-hmm. Whether it's by Zeus or whether it's by his place of, again, not really fitting within the gods, not really fitting in within the Titans, not really being the creator of mankind, but not really their agent in a real way where he's, walking among them and finding friends. He is that very separate, distinct voice from everybody else.
Perhaps that's the beauty and the function of the story of Prometheus, after all, is that on those days where we feel like we're banging our head against the wall and creating the same punishment when we're stuck in Groundhog Day in this loop that we can't get past, at least our liver's not getting pecked out by a fucking eagle. Right? We have this connection to Prometheus that things could always be worse. And mythology gives us that as well, that as lonely and as terrible and as frustrated as we feel, like, exactly, we're not the first person to feel that way. And we're not going to be the last. And here's a story about someone who had it worse than you. And maybe that brings a little solace because misery oftentimes loves company, right?
Yes.
And Prometheus is miserable and he loves some company.
Sometimes like company is needed for misery to heal though too.
Absolutely.
Right. And what's the phrase? A burden shared isn't doubled, it's halved. I think that's a lovely note to end on this evening.
I think so too.
Perfect.
So thank you both for being here for this very first episode of Chaos Theory from the Mything Link. I'm Randall and
Oh, I thought we were done already. I'm Caitlin.
I'm Dr. Caitlin. And we are the Mything Link. Goodbye. Goodbye. Thanks for listening to the Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Ulyate and Caitlinn Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlinn Curry, with music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective, Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening.
Greetings, Earthlings. Welcome.
Greetings.
Greetings.